Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our midweek Bible study. We're going to look tonight at the book of Philemon. We're not actually going to get into the text of Philemon this evening. This is an introduction, and you might think, oh, the text of Philemon, it's so short. It's just one chapter and just a couple of paragraphs. I mean, surely we can cover that in a single night, and there's not much to see there. It is short in terms of the number of words that are in there, but those words are really kind of a big deal. There's a lot to this little tiny book. So I'd like to do an introduction to the book, prepare you for reading it and looking at it closely, and we'll actually get into the text next week. The book of Philemon is a unique book in that it is, in a way, the only truly personal letter that we have in the New Testament documents. There are 6 letters that are written to individuals or very small groups of people. There is 4 letters written by Paul to individuals, and then there are 2 letters written by John. The rest of the letters in the New Testament are written to churches. But here you see the on the screen right now, you see the letters that are written as personal letters written to a person rather than to a church. So 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and then 2nd John, which is written to the elect lady, and to Gaius, which is 3rd John. It wouldn't seem that these letters are unique in that, this letter to Philemon is unique in that there are several letters that are written to just individual persons. So why would I say this is a unique letter in its nature? Well, let's consider each of the other letters. 1 Timothy and Titus are both very similar letters, and they're written to help the person that it's written to set up a church structure. So to help set up church governance and leadership, church ministry, church functioning, these kinds of things. And so neither 1 Timothy nor Titus really focuses on Timothy or Titus, but rather on what Timothy and Titus need to do for the church. So while they're written to individuals, they're not really written about the life of that individual. Similarly, 2 Timothy is a touch more personal because it is going to deal with a lot of Timothy's personal pains and struggles. It's really written more to encourage the life of ministry. How do you maintain freshness and maintain yourself when you're dealing with the pain of serving a church? And so 2 Timothy still is dealing with Timothy with respect to the church and the job that he has in the church. It's not really specific to Timothy's own struggles. 3rd John is written about Gaius, but it's not really about Gaius. It's about a misfunctioning church leader, a heretical church leader named Diotrephes, and all the problems he's causing, and a group of missionaries that John refers to as the brothers, and how to faithfully minister to those people. So again, it's to Gaius, but it's really about church. And then the most enigmatic of the personal letters is this one, 2nd John, written to the elect lady, whoever that is. We don't have her name, don't know much about her, don't even know for sure that it's a her. The elect lady could be an oblique way of referring to a church, in which case the children might be the individual disciples that make up that church. That's one very common theory that you'll run into a lot. She could be a church leader and that her name is not being mentioned as a kind of protection, but at any rate, whoever she is, her big deal, the thing she's got to deal with, is false teachers and the danger that they pose to the church where she is. So, again, it's written to her. It's not really about her. In contrast to all of these stands the letter to Philemon, and in the letter to Philemon, the church kind of recedes into the background. It's mentioned, but it's not the focal point of the letter. The well-being of the church is not what this letter is about. This letter is specific to an issue in Philemon's life and how Philemon is going to deal with the particularly challenging situation and do it Christianly. He has to welcome someone that, according to his culture, he ought to want to punish or even destroy that person. So he's got to do things that are very counter to his culture, and he has to have this letter to instruct him in that. So this letter really isn't about church. And of all the New Testament letters, this is the only one that is like that. So it really is a unique document in the New Testament. So let's go ahead and look at the background, the situation of the letter. What can we know about Philemon, and what can we know about what's going on in his life when we read this letter? First of all, we know that Philemon is a man wealthy enough to own a slave. That doesn't necessarily say much about him. Slaves were found in households of many social strata in the ancient world. So you might have a poor family, and it would still have servants, still have slaves, people that they owned working in their home. They might not have as many, they might have not as many nice things, but they would still have servants, still have slaves. And that's worth noting. This is a side note. This is free. But this is one of the reasons that slavery could exist in such massive numbers in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome as they did. In those societies, slaves made up a little over a third of the population. And so the rest of the population would be divided among all the other social stratas. They are by far, they're not the majority, but they are the largest single plurality of people in the ancient world. And you might think, well, why didn't the slaves just all get together, unite, and overthrow society? And the answer is this reality that slaves would be found in multiple strata, and the slaves themselves did not view themselves as belonging to the class slave. They saw themselves as belonging to the class of whatever class the household they belonged to was. So an upper class, an aristocratic household, the slaves would see themselves as aristocratic slaves. And a middle class or a poor class household, the slaves would see themselves as fitting into that. So they really wouldn't see themselves as part of a large group called slaves, but of each of the strata of society that they belong to. So if you had said, slaves of the ancient world, unite, let's overthrow this oppressive system, they wouldn't have been able to hear that. That would have fallen on deaf ears. That would have just gone right over their head, because they didn't see themselves first as slaves, but first as members of this house. And not really members of it, but belonging, a property of this house. So we don't know for sure where Philemon falls. He could have been a relatively wealthy man or poor man, but at any rate, he owned slaves. It's likely, though it's not certain, that Philemon is head of the household that is mentioned in the letter, because the letter refers to the church that meets in your house, and there wouldn't have been a church in his house if he hadn't. It's likely that he's the head of that house. It's important to know that Philemon had learned the gospel from Paul himself. At some point on Paul's missionary journeys, he came across Philemon. That likely means that Philemon traveled out of Colossae in order to meet Paul, because Paul never went to Colossae. So Paul knows Philemon and has known him well enough to teach him the gospel, and that his reception of the gospel was significant enough that he would see himself, and that Paul would see him as a fellow worker. He would call him that. And there's a church meeting in his home. So we know those things about Philemon personally. We also know that Philemon owned slaves, at least one named Onesimus, who was a deserter from Philemon's household. He ran away. There is some question in the letter about property that Onesimus or money that Onesimus may owe to Philemon, and how Philemon came to owe that. It's possible there's different theories mentioned about this. Some people think that Philemon may have charged Onesimus with stealing something, whether Onesimus actually stole anything or not. Onesimus may have been under the charge of having stolen some property or stolen some money, and that might have motivated Onesimus to do the running away thing in the first place. That's possible. It may also be that Onesimus just decided to run away, and when he did, he took money or property with him in order to finance his escape. But at any rate, there's some question there about Onesimus owing Philemon, in addition to the fact that by being a runaway slave, he would have stolen property from Philemon, and that Onesimus would have stolen himself. So there's some question about stolen property. Providence saw to it that Onesimus met Paul and learned the gospel from him. So after he ran away, he came into contact with Paul while Paul was in prison. And while there, he learned the gospel from Paul and became a Christian. And so now Paul is sending Onesimus back to Philemon, perhaps carrying this letter with him as he sends him back. The letter that we call Philemon is written to help Philemon understand how to deal properly and Christianly with Onesimus, the runaway slave. Paul does not greet Philemon in his letter to the Colossians, or the church that meets in Philemon's household, in spite of the fact that almost everyone believes that Philemon lived in Colossae and would have come into contact with that letter. Now that's significant because the greetings in the letter to the Colossians is almost entirely focused upon Paul and the people who are with Paul, sending their greetings to this unknown group of Christian brothers and sisters that live in the city. Paul only knows two people that we know of. He mentions Nympha and the church that meets in her house. And then there's Philemon, whom he does not mention. Now, if you're Philemon and you know this, you know that Paul knows you and Paul knows Nympha. The two of you are the only people who know Paul, maybe in that city. And he mentions her. And then he mentions a member of your household, but not you. That would have stood out to Philemon and perhaps communicated to him. I'm going to suggest that it likely would communicate, look, there's unfinished business here, and this letter is meant to deal with that. And so that would have put some pressure. That his absence from the book of Colossians might have put some pressure on Philemon in order to take the letter that he wrote specifically to Philemon very seriously. Archippus is told, be sure you complete the ministry that the Lord gave you to do. I suspect that ministry is to Philemon to help Philemon in dealing with the content of the letter. That the letter that Paul wrote is not going to be an easy letter to hear. And Archippus is there, Paul, I think, having sent him from wherever he is back to his home, and is expecting Philemon to hear not only the letter, but then Archippus is supposed to help him deal with it. And then Archippus is one of two members of Philemon's family mentioned by name in the opening of the letter to Philemon. So I suspect he had a big role to play in helping Philemon deal with this really difficult stuff. Let's deal briefly with the major issues that are found in the letter. I think there are really three. Obviously, there is the issue of slavery, and we in our society likely hear that differently than the people in the ancient world would have. There's the concept of justice and how do you treat people rightly. This letter being the only letter written to deal with the individual in their Christian life, you have to pay attention to the big theme of the letter, which is this issue of being good to someone, of giving up your rights and doing things that your culture would consider awkward and bad, doing that in spite of all of it for the sake of love. That's a big theme here, although love is not mentioned, but he's compelled to do it because he's a Christian. And so justice is a significant issue. And then I will spend the bulk of the remainder of the lecture looking at this concept of leadership and power, because the way that Paul interacts with Philemon, I think, is very instructive to us about leadership and authority and power dynamics in church. Let's go ahead and jump right into slavery and dealing with this. As I mentioned, modern Americans are not helped much in their understanding of this letter by the experience of the founding of our country and its involvement in a particularly reprehensible form of slavery. When we think of slavery, we think of things like this slave ship that you see here with people just stacked in like cordwood, and they'd only have a couple of feet above their head. And so for the long journey across the Atlantic, they would be lying on their backs or their stomachs for the entire journey, stacked end to end like this. I mean, it's just nightmarish, the treatment of human beings. And we tend to conflate that experience of slavery with the ancient one. And there is often raised the question, how is it that the New Testament tolerates this? And I think it's worth realizing that in a way it does just that. It tolerates, but does not tolerate in such a way that slavery is left unchallenged. In fact, all of the seeds are sown for the undoing of slavery by Christianity. That sometimes, and even in America, the New Testament documents are used to justify slavery in the fact that it doesn't just say, Christian masters, free your slaves. It doesn't command the abolishment of slavery. But and the fact that anyone would ever use these documents, as was often done in the 17 and 1800s in our country, to justify the ownership of human beings. Look, it's the will of God. It's right here in the New Testament texts. That neglects what is actually done by those texts, because what the text does to the master-slave relationship, and particularly everywhere it's ever addressed, but particularly here in the book of Philemon, it works to undermine it in such a powerful and profound way. It's worth looking also at just how different Roman slavery is from American slavery, because I don't know that the New Testament writers would have tolerated what happened in America as easily as they did the Roman system. And like I said, they worked to undermine it, but I don't know that they would have even tolerated what we in our country did 100 or so years ago. So there are some similarities between ancient slavery and modern slavery. Most slaves in both cultures were captives who were captured and taken prisoner and forced into slavery, either through piracy or through war or through abduction and then selling them. That's true in both cultures. Slaves did not own themselves. That's true in both cultures. So they didn't have the rights to their own labor or to their own bodies even. They belonged to someone else. And then personhood was a difficult concept to nail down in both cultures. And that really does tend to happen anytime you try to own a human being. Because am I owning something with personhood? In the Roman culture, slaves were called instrumentum vocale, which means talking tool, speaking tool, like a hammer that can talk to you. So is that a person or not? Well, no, not really, except when the Romans freed their slaves, they often became Roman citizens and they would then have full personhood. So how does that happen? Does a change in freed status change what you actually are? I guess in the Roman mind it would. Now, that's not true across the entire ancient world. If you had a more Greek perception of slavery, you might see them as having personhood, but it's lesser personhood. The Greeks considered their slaves to be humans, but inferior humans that were lucky to belong to a household. That it was right and good for them to be slaves because it's all they were good for. They weren't really good for anything. But as slaves, they were protected and cared for, and then their life had some kind of meaning because it made somebody else's life better. But were they really full persons? Persons, just lesser persons. In America, a slave was not a person unless you wanted to count the population for the purposes of representation in the government. and then they were 3/5 of a person. Gross. I mean, that's what happens anytime slavery becomes part of a culture, is that it messes with how we see each other as persons. It's one of the biggest and most disgusting realities of the fall, slavery is. It's why God is most motivated. His first redemptive act is to free slaves. It's because we're never meant to belong to one another. It pollutes and breaks our mind. And it's this personhood question where I think that's most obvious. Now, there are some really significant and somewhat dramatic differences. Like I said, the Christian writers, I think, were willing to put up with Roman slavery. I don't know if they would have put up with American slavery, because it was much worse. American slavery, all slaves were captured for the purposes of selling them. It didn't come about at the end of a conflict. And in a way, the ancients anyway would have seen that as not quite so bad. You fought with us, you lost, you're subjugated to us. And part of that subjugation is to take large chunks of your population and turn them into slaves. But there was never any conflict with Western Africa in Europe and America. They colonized those places, and they just abducted massive groups of people. The other big way in the ancient world, I don't have this on the slide, that people would become slaves is that they would be basically kidnapped by pirates and then sold. And what we did is much more like that. The governments were much more like pirates. In America, and this is the most reprehensible portion of it, is that slavery was justified based on racial differences. That if you were of a different race, that's why you weren't human. And that pollution of our thought is why we have such huge racial problems in America to this day. You go to other places in the world and you don't have the kind of racial brokenness that we've got in America. But slavery was justified by treating people as inhuman because they had a different ethnicity. And that's just disgusting. Whereas slavery in Roman times was based more on citizenship differences. You were captured and you belonged to the citizenry of another country. You're now captured by us, and that gives us the right to own you. Still kind of ugly, but it's less dehumanizing. And then in American slavery, slaves had no rights or dignity. A master could do anything to a slave. You could beat them to death if you wanted to. You could rape them nightly if you wanted to, because they weren't fully human. That degradation is nasty both to the slave and to the master in the corruption that it does to both. Whereas in Roman slavery, slaves had some limited human rights, although the Romans didn't tend to think in those terms. But there were some limits placed on what could really be done by a master to a slave. And then some distinctives of Roman slavery that are nothing like American slavery. And this is one of the things that made the whole situation more complex. People could sell themselves into slavery for a set period of time in order to pay off a debt. Imagine a credit card company that could come in and say, you're not going to pay this debt, but we will own you for these 6 years, and then we'll release you and set you free. That kind of slavery was very common in the Roman world. Another reality, people could enter into slavery for a time in order to gain Roman citizenship. And here you're talking about a free person, but who is not a Roman citizen, could go and say, I would like to be a slave in your household because you guys are Roman citizens. And then once I'm in there, now I'm part of this household. I have this status conferred on me. So a person could enter into that voluntarily, and that was not uncommon. After 7 years or 10 years, whatever the agreed upon period is, they're set free. Now they're a Roman citizen. So that reality exists, and that has some question of, that's nowhere near the moral degradation that you have in kidnapping and selling you. It's just not even close to the same. Now, during that time period, whatever your contract is, you're not going to have human rights, but you know that you're going to be free. And then The loss of Roman citizenship might result in what's called punitive slavery, where you would be put into the salt mines, or you would be put into a galley in a ship, where you're basically worked to death. And the movie Gladiator is not inaccurate in the way that punitive slavery functioned. It was designed to get as much out of you as it could before it killed you. It was a kind of death sentence. Before I move on from this topic, I want to point out that this is not a reality that has faded away. American slavery based on race is something that has been abolished by law. But human beings still own human beings to this day. And we think, well, yeah, that's true in other cultures. Yes, it is true in other cultures. There are still cultures in the world where slavery is incredibly common. But even in ours, there's an organization known as Exodus Cry. Exodus Cry, its whole purpose is the liberation of people from slavery. And they say everyone should be free. And they focus on human trafficking, primarily human sex trafficking, which is where we, in our culture, still have an awful lot of slavery going on. There are a lot of people who find themselves owned by organizations that then sell them for sexuality. A lot of porn is produced by slaves, and a lot of pornography, a lot of prostitution, a lot of sexual slavery exists in our country to this day. And then there's also a lot of labor-based slavery around the world. And Exodus Cry takes that on. The humanizing nature of what we see in the book of Philemon would encourage us to challenge slavery any time we encounter it and every time we encounter it. The Bible takes it seriously that human beings should be free. Remember, the first redemptive act of God was an attack upon slavery. It was, let my people go, free my people from their bondage to slavery. So this is a very important biblical theme. And what the book of Philemon sets in place, even in a culture that was so based on it, is that eventually Christianity would overtake that culture. And when it did, the humanizing reality of the book of Philemon would eventually undermine the existence of slavery altogether. How did it do that? Well, it did that through its great concern for how human beings should justly treat one another. Remember, this book is written about how a man should treat a runaway slave. It's just simply got to inform our thinking that the only letter truly written to an individual person, not about a church, but written to an individual, was about how that person ought to treat another individual whose life was in his power. That has to do with justice. How do we treat one another? And this letter is calling on Philemon to behave well. The big issue of this letter is that Philemon must treat Onesimus as a human, not a thing. That tells us that the big thrust of the New Testament, at least one of the big thrusts of our changed life, our transformed nature as saved people, is to take on a duty to one another. We have to take one another very seriously. One of the big threats to that is the idea of, well, I get to have my rights. I want to be free from other people. And one of the big ways we do that is through our understanding of rights. And Paul will tell us that Philemon is well within his rights. I mean, it's clearly implied. Philemon, you have a choice about what to do with Onesimus now. I'm giving him back to you, sending him back into your care. And you can do whatever you will with him because that's what the culture says. No one will punish Philemon if he blinds Onesimus. No one will punish Philemon if he beats Onesimus. No one will punish Philemon if he turns Onesimus over to punitive slavery where he dies. Okay, those are all things that he could do. But there are things that he ought to do, both based on the fact that he's a human being and especially based on the faght that he's a Christian. And that those things might not be encouraged or even respected by his culture, but they're still things he ought to do. Because human beings are designed by a God, we are designed to live a certain way. And those things are expected of Philemon. So he ought to do what's right. But his culture won't encourage him in that. And then there are other things that it would be wrong to do that are entirely in his power. But they would be wrong to do those both as a human being and as a Christian. It is always wrong to attack and harm another person. Our nature is designed to be loving. And so we ought not do harm to those who are at our mercy. That's just not what we should do. It would be wrong, both as a human being and as a Christian, for him to do bad things to Onesimus. But his culture would expect him to. And so he would be within his rights. And the question is, are you going to do what's within your rights or what is right? For this is what I mean by that. For Philemon to fail to punish Onesimus would have big social ramifications. Other people would notice it, and they would not look kindly on it. By giving up his rights, Philemon would appear to be weak in public, and people would look down on him for that. But that wouldn't be the end of it. He would also defy social expectations of Roman masters. A Roman master would expect to deal very, very harshly with a runaway slave. That would be expected of a Roman master. And obviously, Paul is not wanting him to do that. But that might potentially undermine the entire social system. If you've got, especially if he is a prominent citizen in Colossae, and he is kind and loving towards a runaway slave, what are other slaves going to think? What is this going to do to the social system? So there's going to be a lot of pressure on Philemon. You have to do what is right in society's eyes. You've got to punish a runaway slave. But obviously, Paul doesn't want him to do that. Christ doesn't want him to do that. So how is Philemon going to deal with that? Well, that pushes us towards the question, the bigger overall question of human justice. Because our cultures affirm things that are just that aren't, and disaffirm things that truly are just and says they're not. And this letter kind of highlights that and says, you need to do the right thing, and the right thing is always Christ's expectations. Let me just throw a few thought questions at you. Does Onesimus' change in status from an unbeliever to a believer, he becomes a Christian, does that mean that there would be a change with respect to what would be right for a Christian master to do with him? What I mean by that is, if Onesimus hadn't become a Christian, and Paul had sent him back into Philemon's care, wouldn't it have still been the right thing for Philemon to do to be good to him? Now, his change in status may be an added reason for him to be good to him, but even to an unbelieving slave, wouldn't it have still been right to be good to him? Would it be okay for a Christian master ever to sell an unbelieving slave into punitive slavery? But would it be okay to do that, but not okay to sell a believing slave into punitive? Or would it be just as wrong to sell either of them into that kind of hostile end of life situation? Why would it be wrong to do that? I think it would always be wrong to do that. Would his change in status change whether or not it's wrong? Well, it would make it worse because you would be selling Christ in that person into punitive slavery. This person for whom Christ died. But remember, Christ died for all of us. If Philemon were already a Christian, how is it that a slave in his house only learns about Christianity by running away from his house? What does that tell you about Philemon and how he sees Onesimus' personhood before he's returned to him as a Christian? Who is it in our culture that we easily ignore who ought to hear the gospel from us, and instead of hearing the gospel from us, they get despised by us. This letter challenges that behavior. By the fact that Onesimus comes back to him a Christian, it raises the question, why was he not already a Christian? If Philemon had become a Christian, and then Onesimus runs away, and then he comes back a Christian, why did he have to run away to become a Christian? He had a Christian master. Shouldn't Philemon have done something about that? All of this sows seeds into how do Christians ever own slaves, and how do Christians treat people who are in their power. All of that sows the seeds for the undoing of slavery in the ancient world. As Christianity becomes a greater and greater influence over time, these questions of the humanity of slaves, the personhood of slaves, the Christian belief of slaves. If Onesimus can become a believer, then shouldn't all slaves become believers? But if all slaves become believers, how do you own them? How does one person own their brother? How do you do that? It undermines and destroys the social reality of slavery. Okay, with the remainder of our time together this evening, I want to talk about how Paul uses his authority in Philemon's life. And I want to begin by talking about the nature of power. So power is the ability to cause another person to behave in the way that the power holder wants that other person to behave. That's how power is sociologically described. Authority is the legitimate right to wield power in the life of another person. So they're related terms, but they're not the same. If you have authority in my life, then you have the right to use power in my life. But power doesn't necessarily come linked to authority all the time. Sometimes a person may use power even though they don't really have the authority to do it. So let's talk about what power is just a little more. Power, according to the sociological definition, power is the ability of A to influence the behavior of person B minus the ability of B to offer resistance to the will of person A. That's what that collection of symbols at the top there of the slide means. So person A wants person B to do something that person B doesn't want to do. If person B has enough ability to resist the will of person A, then person A cannot be said to have power in person B's life because they won't do it. If they can resist it and overcome it, then they won't behave that way. If, however, person B doesn't have enough resistance and person A does have enough influence to drive person B's behavior, even though person B doesn't want to do it, then person A has power in that person's life. In sociology, power always assumes a difference between the will of person A and person B, and that person B is offering resistance, that there is always resistance if power is exercised. If there's no resistance, then power is not used. Now, I will suggest that human power is almost always an unloving action. It is at its best a neutral act, but most often when power is used, it is in violation of the human dignity of another person. Now, there are times when power can be used neutrally, and there are times when power is used together with God, and we'll get into that later. But if I use power according to this definition, the definition you see on the screen, where I'm overcoming resistance instead of leading you and persuading you, then I've disregarded your will in favor of my own, and I am violating your human dignity. Okay, that is, I think, in the nature of power. Sociologists will discuss 5 types of power, and we'll discuss each of those briefly right now. So the 5 types of power are coercive power, reward-based power, what's called legitimate power, expert power, and then one that is either called charismatic or referent power, depending on which of those which person you're reading. They will call it one of those two. There is another sometimes called informational power. I think that is a form of expert power, so I just lump those in together. You might find different rubrics, but these are the ones that I find the most helpful and simple for understanding how power works. Now, I've put them in this order on purpose because they are on a scale. Towards the top of the list, it has more to do with what can I do to you or what can I do for you. As you move down the list, it has increasingly what kind of person am I in your life. So who am I as a person? That's what loads me up with power. The further down the list I go, the more that becomes true. Also, these types of power are not necessarily separated from one another. Imagine them as being like, you can check this box if you have that kind of power in my life. And the more boxes that you're able to check, the more power that you have in my life. If you can check all of these boxes, the chances that I'm going to be able to resist you are almost nil. If you're old enough, you may remember Jonestown in Guyana. And in Jonestown, it was run by a guy named Jim Jones, who it was a cult leader who ended up convincing all of the cult members to drink Kool-Aid in which had been mixed a kind of poison. The parents fed this stuff to their children, and then they drank it themselves. And it was, I don't remember, something like 800 or 900 people died in Jonestown. Why would they do that? Well, the reality was Jim Jones was seen as having all of these forms of power, and the ability of all of those people to resist that one man was all very, very low. It's horrifying. I've heard it. There is a recording of them having an argument or a discussion as a cult before they do this. And there are people who try to offer resistance and try to argue with Jim Jones and say, no, let's not do this. Those people offering resistance also drank the Kool-Aid and died. He had so much power that he was able to persuade people to commit suicide. That's what power can do. You can overcome other people's wills. Let's talk about these, and we'll start with the ones that you may have heard of the concept of a carrot and a stick. The first two forms of power are just that, stick and carrot. So let's talk about these. The first form is coercive power, and that's the ability to punish. If you don't do what I say, then I will cause something unpleasant to happen in your life. You'll suffer some sort of unfortunate consequence. So you might hear you're fired or pay the fine or go to jail or you go sleep on the couch or you're grounded or whatever. All of those are forms of coercive power. They are meant to alter someone's behavior through the threat of punishment. This is a very powerful force of power. There's a very strong power source if you have the right coercion. If you really can fire me and I don't think I can get another job, maybe I'm going to have to do whatever I have to do in order to keep this job because I don't want to lose it. Okay? That's coercive power. On the other end of the spectrum of what I can do for or to you is what I can do for you, which is reward power. And this is the ability to give you something that you want. If you'll do what I want, I will give you a reward. So you'll get a raise or a promotion or you'll mow the lawn. If you mow the lawn, I'll take us out for ice cream. I'll take the whole family out if you mow the lawn. Well, I want that reward, so I'm willing to do it. That kind of power these are manipulative tools where I will either punish or I will reward. They're opposites, but they really are basically the same kind of power in that they both flow from what I can do for you or to you. Now, moving down the list as we move more towards who the person is, we get to legitimate power. And this is where society has decided that I'm a person who gets to tell you what to do. Anytime you get pulled over for a traffic infraction, you're being controlled by legitimate power. The highway patrolman who has pulled you over is wearing a uniform that speaks to the legitimization of their power. They're driving a car that has lights on it that's both a communication signal that says you have to pull over, but also says, I have the authority to pull you over. These lights tell you that. And you'll see that in a lot of official capacities. Because they occupy an office, they have the right to tell you what to do. So the office of governor or the office of president. The nature of this power is connected to the person, but only because the person is connected to an office. So it has more to do with who they are than those first two forms of power, but it's not fully connected to them. The office of the presidency is a powerful office, but the person who occupies the office is the only one who gets to use the power. And when that person leaves office, either because they're voted out or because their term expires, then that person no longer has that power. Why? Because they're no longer connected to that office. So legitimate power has to do with an office that you hold. So it's connected to you, but only because you're connected to the office. And the next level down is power that arises from information, power that arises particularly from a level of expertise. I know more than you do, therefore you must do as I say. Okay? So your doctor tells you to change your diet, and you don't want to change your diet. You like Snickers bars, and you don't want to stop eating Snickers bars, but they tell you, look, if you don't change your diet, you're going to die. What do? Well, maybe you change your diet. If you do, they have exercised expert power in your life. I've seen this a lot in church where a preacher knows Greek or they know Hebrew, and they use that against people who don't. They say, you can't question me because I know these words and what they mean. And you're right. You do know that, and I don't. So I guess I can't argue with you because I don't know how. I don't even know how to start that. I don't ever do that. I will bring up the Greek words and tell you what they mean, but I don't ever want to use it to manipulate or control you. I really work hard not to win an argument that way because I think it's evil. I actually think that's evil because it is a power play. Rather than, honestly, the translations work really well. Let's talk about what the meaning of the text is together. This is a power tool that is very often used by preachers. Or a mechanic forces you to pay a bunch of money to get your car fixed, and you're never sure whether that was actually what was wrong with your car or not. And if it wasn't what was wrong with your car, then yeah, they've used power on you. And that's expert power. It flows from information that the power wielder has, and those it's being used against, they don't have that power. Finally, you have referent power, and referent power arises from charisma or the presence. A person has a particular personality mix or a collection of skills or gifts, and that can give them great referent power. Referent power comes from not the power holder's desire to be like the person they're manipulating, but the manipulated person's desire. The person power is working on to be with or like that other person. They surrender to the other person. So because I admire you, I allow your will to become mine, even if when we started out, it wasn't. Okay? So most people who really significantly change the world do so through referent power. Other forms of power have to always kind of be maintained, but referent power can continue to function even after the power source is gone. For instance, the man on the screen right here, he changed America in huge ways. Are there 2 drinking fountains for white people and black people anymore? No, of course not. Why? Largely because of this man's referent power. Okay, so they change the world, but not necessarily for good. The man you see on the screen now, he also had massive amounts of referent power. People really looked up to him. And even though they may not have been anti-Semites when things started, they may not have hated Jewish people when things started, by the time this man's power had worked on him, on the nation, there was so much anti-Semitism in Germany that they could murder people without pause. That is the great persuasive ability of referent power. And of course, you and I, in a sense, we are drawn to another man who works primarily through referent power. Although rather than get his own ends, generally that man gets God's ends in our life and leads us to want what God wants. Okay, now let's talk about, having laid out those categories of power. Let's talk about the nature of power a bit and how it affects us. Power does not care how you use it. It simply enables you to get your will accomplished, regardless of what your will might be. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have other effects as well. It does. When we use power, power has natural effects on both the power holder and the one upon whom power is used. But it doesn't care what your will is. Power just helps you get your will done. So your will might be good or it might be really evil. But power is just there to get your will accomplished in the life of other people. I already mentioned this, but in sociology, it is always assumed that power is used where there is resistance in the will of one person upon whom power is exercised to the will of the power holder. So the one person doesn't want to do something and the power holder wants that thing done, and there's resistance there. Where there is no resistance, sociologists will say that those two people are just working in cooperation and no power is necessary. So power only comes into play. The only time that ever happens is because one person is made to do something that he or she did not want to do. And that unwilling action was caused by the will of another person. I think it's worth noting that power can actually be used to change our will. So it's not always the case that when power is used on us, we end up in a place of resentment. Adolf Hitler, mentioned a moment ago, used the great charismatic nature that he had in order to change the will of other people and bring them in line with his own. Now, the fact that his own will was so nasty and corrupted, that didn't matter. The power was in his referent power. But by the time people were wooed over to him, they agreed with him. So they wouldn't necessarily have said, power's been used on me. And yet that one man transformed the wills of so many other people. Now, I want to point this out. This is a very big deal, especially as we deal with the letter to Philemon, because there's a lot of power going on in the letter to Philemon. But I want us to notice this. Human power differs from God's power. Okay? Human power is always A against B. Person A is against person B, or person B is resistant to person A. And the power is used to overcome resistance. Different from that is this. God typically uses power in such a way that it is A together with B, A being God, using power together with to empower, to help B get what B wants. Now, I say typically because God will sometimes use his power to judge a person or a group of people. And when he does that, the people are generally not getting what they want. He uses his power generally to destroy them. But he also isn't necessarily changing their will at that point to come into line with him. Instead, he has assessed that their will is not going to change, and he destroys or he punishes. Okay? And he does that through an exercise of his power. But his desired way of using his power, and the way that the New Testament will emphasize, the way that shows up, I think, in the book of Philemon, is that it is power together with, so that the person their will isn't overruled. God rarely overrules our will. Instead, he works together with our will. His power is found inside of our will, overcoming our weakness and helping us to do that which we could not do without his help. So that's how God exercises power, and it is radically different from human exercising power. Now, here's the truth. Here's the reality. I may not want what God wants at first. In a way, I think all of us want what God wants, and none of us want what God wants. All of us want to be good people, and all of us want for our will to lead to good places. But sin messes up how we understand how we get there. No one ever does evil thinking, this will be really bad for me and I'll suffer a lot. Yahoo, I'm going to go do it. No, our will is always directed towards what we think will be best for us. It's just that we're really bad at assessing that, and we need to hear God teach us and train us. So I may need help getting my will to want that which I actually ought to want. I may need the retraining work of God, and in that way, he may need to influence my will against my natural proclivities. But even with my will realigned, even once I get to where I'm like, okay, I know I ought to love that person, that does not mean that I'm going to be able to. The knowing what I should do and the ability to do it are not the same thing. So it's God's power that enables me to do what I ought to do. It enables the rightly trained will to do that which it wants to do. So once my will is trained to want what God wants, that's when God's power is able to push me in the direction that I want to go. We're going to see a lot of that in the book of Philemon. So a person might ask, well, what about the repeated calls for us to submit to those who are in authority over us that appear throughout the New Testament? You hear that again and again. Doesn't that suggest that power can be legitimate? Well, yes and no. Yes, there is such a thing as authority, and authority is the right to exercise power. But there may be circumstances where it's kind of the lesser of two evils, where human power might even need to be resorted to. Where someone is acting in recalcitrant, evil ways, you might have to use something that at least looks a lot like human power. But this is worth noticing. God's power works through his servants, and those who have authority in our lives, according to the New Testament text, do so because their lives are aligned with God. They have lined up their lives with Jesus. And why would I say that? Well, what are the qualifications for elders meant to help us select? But people who have their lives well in line with Jesus. Okay? So that's why they have authority. They are lined up with God. And then God's power can work through them. And so it will be together with power instead of overcoming your resistance, breaking your will kind of power. There are characteristics of godly uses of power, God's kind of power, that you can recognize. And you'll see some of them as you read the book of Philemon. Paul uses them in Philemon's life. First of all, power is never used for the servant of God's self-interested goals, but it's always God's goals in the life of the other person. The godly leader may use authority and power in your life, but if they do, they are trying to help you to become the best Christian that you can be. They are not trying to get what they want out of you and get their own satisfaction and their own happiness. They are trying to lead you to the best way of life that you can, because that's God's will in your life. So they're trying to help you get what you want. If you feel violated by the power that's used in your life, either you are really recalcitrant and sinful, or it's not godly power. Also, the will of God is made clear to the other person. So When someone uses godly power, the first thing that they're doing is helping you figure out what God wants from you. The resources available to assist obedience are also made clear so that you can know, okay, this is going to be hard. How do I get through this? These are things you can call on that will help you get there. And then the reward and consequence that comes from God, not the leader, but from God. Those are also made clear. So all of that is made clear to you so that God can work through what the leader has told you. But then, and this is, I think, most important of all, the option to exercise the human will for or against God's will is always left intact and available in the individual. Their will is not overpowered, but assisted. Okay, that is a godly use of power. If a person wants to continue to misbehave, they are allowed to do so. Now, at that point, the godly leader may need to cordon that person off from others. They may need to then begin to minimize their destructive power. Generally, they've informed the person, this is what I'll have to do if you don't come into line with God's will, but I don't want to do that. But they don't force the person to behave differently. Jesus himself once was with a person and he loved that person. The guy had come to him and said, what do I have to do to earn eternal life? And he told him the law. And he said, I've done all that from my childhood. What do I still lack? He said, go and sell everything that you have and then come and follow me. He did that come and follow me thing because he wanted him to be his disciple. He loved him. But he let the guy walk away sad because he refused to violate his human dignity. See, that's what God's power looks like. If you're being violated, if you're being attacked, if you're being demeaned, you're encountering human power. Okay? Now, you may still make horrible decisions. That guy did. That rich young ruler, he made the worst decision of his life. But you're allowed to do it. God allows that. Okay, so why not use human power? I mean, so okay that maybe it's not real godly, but it's efficient and it gets a lot done. Why not use it? Let me give you a few reasons. First of all, human power stunts the development of those upon whom it is used. When you use power against another person, the only way in which they use their will is to try to resist you. Once they've given up, they're not using their will anymore. That is very bad for us as people. If you're not using your will, then you're not using your decision-making abilities, and you're not growing up. You're not becoming a person who discerns God's will for themselves. You're becoming a person who is entirely reliant upon power holders. The more submissive and powerless a community of a church is, the more likely it is that a lot of human power has been used against them. And that they've become weak in their own will, because the only way they ever use will is to complain about, gripe, and resist the will of those who force them to do what they don't want to do, instead of learning to do what they should do. Learning and a godly power puts in front of you, you still have the choice. Please choose life and not death. But I'm going to cooperate with you. I will help you, but I'm not going to force you to do anything. I will help you to do what is good. So will all these other people. A church that's helping each other causes us to grow up into maturity. When human power is used against each other, we become less mature. As you read the book of Philemon, you will see that Paul is very concerned with Philemon's spiritual maturity. In that Philemon always is left with the option. It's very clear what he should do, but he's left with the ability to choose, and that means Philemon's going to have to grow up. When we use power and force, if Paul had used power to force his will on Philemon, and he says, I have the right to do that. I could do that, but he's not going to do that because he knows what it will do to Philemon. It might get Philemon to act in the way that's mature. It won't help Philemon to be mature. Think about the people that you've known who are really immature. They have to keep coming back again and again and again to basic problems, and they haven't solved them. Chances are good a lot of power is being used against them in their life. The other problems, that's the biggest problem, honestly. That's the biggest reason I shun human power. I don't ever want it because it does bad things to those against whom it is used. But it causes a whole lot of other problems too. Where human power is used rather than God's power, you end up with power struggles because people want their will. I want what I want. If I can get some of that power stuff, I can get what I want. And so you get people who are vying against one another, playing political games against one another, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes very overtly, trying to get the power to run things. Even if they do the power behind the power, if they can control another person and put that person in power, then they can be the power player. Well, those kinds of power struggles don't show up where people work with God because God's power is always cooperative, not conflictual. That's the other thing. It generates loads of conflict. You get a lot of conflict in a power-based system because people are always fighting against one another rather than working cooperatively together. Another thing is that it foments rebellion because you can force me to do what you want doesn't mean that you can force me to want what you want. And if I've been violated a lot of times, I'm sick of you. And so I get this anger and hatred building up in me. Human power generates that. And we rebel against even godly leaders if they use human power. And then the most common reality is that human power systems are filled with division rather than unity. The only way a human power-based system can produce unity is if there's sufficient power constantly clamped down the system. If I break the will of those above me, I'll get punished. If I do what those above me want, I get rewarded. And that's constantly being reinforced. Okay, I'll cooperate, and you'll get a kind of uniformity. But what you don't get is loving unity. Because in order to do that, I have to exercise my will, and power violates and I think I said finally, this is really the final point. It produces a kind of allergic reaction to the power of God. Human power, when it's exercised on us long enough, we don't want to cooperate with our leaders or anybody else. And so power needs to be used in God's ways. Now, in this letter, Paul is doing a lot to help Philemon do what Christianity requires him with respect to how he treats Onesimus. So as you read this letter, pay attention to that. We don't know the condition of Philemon's will and heart before he gets the letter, but the fact that this long letter has been written, or it's not long, but the fact that this letter has been written with all of the power plays that Paul is going to use here suggests that his will is very much in line with his culture, and Onesimus is in real trouble if Philemon stays there. So what we see is God working through Paul in Philemon's life to reorient Philemon's will and then empower that will to do what he ought to do. And it's a very short letter, but a very small dose of God's power is sufficient to do amazing things. So, wrapping up, in your reading this week, pay attention to how Paul is using power. If you want, you could even go back and look at the section of this video that talks about the different forms of power and see if you see anything of coercion, anything of reward, anything of referent power. What kind of power is being used here? But look for how Paul is using power. Upon what forms of power does Paul draw? And what makes Paul's use of power legitimate or godly in Philemon's life? And where and how do you see evidence of God's kind of power at work in this letter? Okay. Oh, I've gone 10 minutes long. I apologize for that. But I look forward to being with you again next. Well, we won't be together again, but I look forward to doing the next lecture. In the meantime, read through the letter. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to raise, the comments section on YouTube would be a great place to do that. We can have discussion there. We can have comments there. Please feel free to use the discussion question that you'll find below. Okay. God bless. Have a great week.